It's This Week in Charles Bronson, a highly uncalled for look at pop culture and news through the steely cat-eyed gaze of America's number one action movie star. And I am your host, Eric Todd. And tonight is a Tough Guy Book Club exclusive, a Tough Guy Book Club like no other one. So tough it could only be called Tough as Leather. We sit down with two titans of journalism and celebrity bios to discuss the centenary of two of Hollywood's greats. In this corner, we have Burt Kearns, author of Marlon Brando, Hollywood Rebel. And in the other corner, we have Dwayne Chino Epstein, author of uh, Lee Marvin Point Blank, the biography of Lee Marvin, and Killing Generals, the making of the Dirty Dozen. And we're going to discuss the centenary. Is that the word? We're going to discuss the centenary, the 100-year mark of these two stars, and we're going to answer that musical question asked by Josie Cotton in 1982. Johhny, as in Johnny Stabler, are you queer?
Very nice segue.
Thank you very
Very good.
much. I work hard on that. Hopefully, maybe Danny can put that song in the beginning or towards the end. But that was a song in the '80s that I thought
Yep.
made me think of this. Talking of the Wild One, and before we get into the Wild One and its influences and Lee Marvin and the whole thing, being born in 1975, Marlon Brando, was he was before I ever seen any of his movies or even a clip of any of his movies, he was already like two or three iconic posters that you would see everywhere. And he was at least like four or five like different quotes, famous film quotes that I would hear in sitcoms or whatever. Like if you went to talking to the posters, if you went to a 50s themed diner or a Harley Davidson shop, you saw the Wild One poster. I see that poster, that image was part of my life probably for 18, 19 years before I ever seen that actual movie, which I believe was the first movie of his I ever watched. And every pizza place to this day still has the Godfather poster. And then you talk about the quotes and the from the movies. I mean, Offer You Can't Refuse, Could Have Been a Contender, Stella, all those things I had heard in sitcoms. They were used parodied for laughs. You know what I mean? And even when I donned a motorcycle jacket for the first time, trying to be cool and rock and roll and punk rock, I didn't even realize that that I was that I was paying tribute to something created by Marlon Brando in 1953. It was to the point it was almost like parody at that point, almost like I thought I was super cool, but really like the fact that I didn't know, was almost a joke. Um, and this nomadic, I have it written down as nomadic influence because it travels in and out of all different parts of pop culture and society, um, can all be pinpoint back to the Wild One, and in some instances just that iconic image. Bert, why do you think that image and that character is so influential on so many different cultures um, and on society?
Well, it is the iconic image of the rebel, of youth, of of charisma, and of bucking against authority. I mean, I grew up in the 1960s, and I had that poster on my wall. I had that poster from the Wild One on my wall next to the poster of Peter Fonda on his motorcycle in Easy Rider with the
Mhm.
red, white, and blue gas tank. Black and white poster that I colored in with magic marker or crayon, colored in red, white, and blue because that was the image I had of Marlon Brando in the 1960s. I hadn't seen his movies. I was a kid. The Godfather didn't come out till 1972. And Brando was in that pantheon of rock and roll rebels. And it wasn't just the picture, but again, as you mentioned, it was in pop culture at the time. Herman Munster and the Munsters doing his version of Brando. in the Rock and Roll Herman, Hot Rod Herman
Yeah.
episode. Jethro Bodine did his version, the Beverly Hillbillies. And then you had the Beach movies where you had Harvey Lembeck as Eric Von Zipper, as the head of the Rats. You know, it was part of the zeitgeist. It was part of pop culture because no image and no film really encapsulated that rebelliousness. I mean, Brando's film came out in 1953, really hit all the screens in 1954. And at the time, there weren't biker movies and there wasn't a youth market. But this film came out and it launched a rock and roll revolution, even though there wasn't any rock and roll in the picture at all, just because of
Right.
the way these guys acted. They saw that image of this guy in a leather jacket.
I
This
just
was
want
the
to
new.
add something. I just want to add something real quick, since we're all
Right.
talking about that influence. When I was going to high school in the '70s, there was a probably because of American Graffiti and other things. There was this popularity of revising the '50s,
Yeah.
and there was '50s dance when I was in high school, my senior year. I went as Johhny from the Wild One. I had my girlfriend, my sister's boyfriend had a leather jacket, and I wore it, and I wore the jeans, and I wore the white T-shirt with the black collar, the black piping, and my dad had a yachting cap that he never wore, and I
Mhm.
took the insignia off and I wore that. So
And that
I'm in there
that
with you,
that
boys.
that,
I'm
that
right there.
happened that happened again in like the 80s, early 90s, because I remember going through a rockabilly phase and being really interested in Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis and Little Richard and stuff like that.
Yeah, and the Stray Cats helped that a lot,
Yeah, Stray Cats, and then later on bands like the Cramps,
right?
um,
Oh, yeah.
Flat Duo Jets, who we just lost. Um, oh my God, his name is escaping me right now, but he just passed. But yeah, that came back every few generations. That kind of came back, and um, and I remember when I was like 18, I remember watching the Wild One, and at the time, I liked I was a bigger fan of like the cheaper ones, like Drag Strip Girl, and like some of the ones you mentioned in the book. Anything with Arkoff or with that name on it, Samuel Z or
Oh, yeah.
Arkoff or the other name. And I remember I didn't quite get the Wild One, but I was luckily I watched it again recently. And I do a lot of you notice like you send me the book and it's like 5 months later because it takes me it takes me a while to read, and I have a little bit of a I think I might have a little bit of a learning disability, but I love to read, and I refuse to do one of these shows without reading the whole thing and then like maybe going over it again. So I take my time and then I watch a couple movies. But the image in that movie, it kind of redefined masculinity in a way. Like, and one of the words that you use in the book to describe him and to describe why he was the ultimate punk, which was written by one of your friends, Legs McNeil, was vulnerability. And I liked that you said that when you're talking about how that um that his image of masculinity, which had a touch of femininity in it, but I mean, any kind of vulnerability was seen as femininity back then. You know what I mean? Because they had these John Waynes and these type of guys. So it really spoke to people in these kind of groups like homosexuals and punk rock. And I like that you mentioned that because punk rock always gets this image of like there tries to be this image of being tough guys, but it's really vulnerable. It's really not tough guys. It's more people punk rock to me in its essence was more like not wanting to grow up and throwing a tantrum about it into a microphone. And I believe like that sensitive kind of lost vulnerable character really it spoke to so many different generations, and it echoed from there on forward, and sometimes and in some places just that image. Is that correct, Bert? Like just that poster.
Well, yeah, I mean, Brando totally redefined what a Hollywood leading man was at the time. I mean, Brando came out, he definitely had this, one critic called it a bisexual charisma. You know, Gene Hackman said he was the most feminine of actors, although he had a lot of masculinity as well. And Brando, I mean, in his first film, The Men, Brando wept and he cried. Leading men, you don't see John Wayne crying or Gary Cooper crying. In the Wild One, there's a scene after he is beaten up and after he's on the run, he
Beaten up.
stops and has a little cry. And you don't see your leading man do that. And it led to a different kind of leading man. You went from a guy like Lee Marvin, you went to an Elvis or a James Dean, or today you've got like Timothy Chalamet, this very, adolescent type leading man, which followed all because of Brando. And he did have that vulnerability. Punk rock was for the outcasts, the outsiders. There were gays in punk rock, the B-52s, et cetera. You had women in punk rock and the Talking Heads and bands like that. It was all outsiders that came together. And somebody like Brando is a great rallying point for that, because people were drawn to his vulnerability and to the fact that he was very open about the fact that he was bisexual. Well, again, Hollywood leading men weren't like that at all. And it came out in his performances.
Now, back then, something like that was always like hidden by the studios. Sometimes they would go to outrageous attempts to hide those things. Brando never hid his sexuality, but yet most of my life I remember hearing those things as like rumors. People would still say, "Ah, that's just a rumor." It's almost as if society itself wasn't accepting, because he didn't hide it at all, did he?
No, but unlike a Rock Hudson or a Jim Nabors or a Roddy McDowell, Brando was also known for all the women that he quote scored. I mean,
Right.
he was an equal opportunity screwer, I guess. He had the sex with a lot of women and men as well. He would say he didn't consider himself to be homosexual. He said, sometimes I do it because it makes the person feel good, or they did me a favor,
Right.
I'll do it to make them happy. To him, sex was just
I'd like to add
sexless.
something about what's being said here, if I may.
Of course, go.
There's while you're right that the culture at large wouldn't really know about any of the sexual proclivities of Marlon Brando and James Dean, Montgomery Clift, Rock Hudson. However, that's the culture at large. I think outside of that milieu of the larger culture, I think a lot of people knew. And if they didn't know, it was probably because they didn't want to know. And the people who did know gave it a wink. It's like, well, we'll let him be like that, but it's not going to affect what I think of them. Unless, of course, they did know, and it did affect the way they thought of that person. But I mean, Montgomery Clift was, in my opinion, one of the most prominent secret gay men. But everybody knew he was gay, even if they didn't want to admit it. And famously, John Wayne once said, which I found surprising in an interview, when it was mentioned about Rock Hudson's sexual preferences, he made a movie with John Wayne and Rock Hudson were in a movie together in the late '60s, and The Undefeated. And John Wayne said, what he does in his private life is his business, as long as he shows up on time and knows his lines. So I was blown away when I read that John Wayne said that. But that's, an individual thing. Otherwise, what you're talking about in terms of the sexuality of different men, okay, there's Lee Marvin. Watch the way I work this in. Lee Marvin gave an interview in Playboy magazine in which he shocked the guy doing the interview by saying, I would never have a problem playing a gay character.
Really?
Marvin said that. It was in the 15th anniversary issue of Playboy. And because it was 1969, and because he was a pretty big star then, they figured they would make him the prominent person in the issue. And he said, I wouldn't care if somebody gets off by sticking a shoe in their ear. It's up to them. It's their life. They can do what they want, as long as you're not doing harm to anybody. And then and that's when he proceeded to talk about being able, if need be, to play a gay character. He wouldn't think twice about it, which I was amazed. Do you remember, what was it? About a year or two, somehow social media woke up and discovered an interview John Wayne gave in Playboy about his feelings about racism. And a lot of people were shocked by it. It's like, this isn't new, folks. He's been like that all of his public life, okay? But The same thing kind of happened when I came out with my Lee Marvin project, in that people were like, "Wow, Lee Marvin said that? Yeah, he said that."
I'm kind
And
of surprised to hear that because I kind of think of him as like I kind of think of him as like
muy
that.
macho, yeah.
Yeah, real macho. And to get to the point of the wild one, and to get to the topic of whether or not the story was, as Burt believes, a love story between Johnny Stabler and Chino. If let's just say it was, if Marlon Brando represents that kind of vulnerable kind of more feminine side, Lee Marvin kind of would be, I would say, like the guy that's trying to cover it all up with with being super tough
Overly
and
macho,
super
yeah.
drunk all the time. And in a way, it almost seems like from some of the stories I heard in his real life, Lee Marvin kind of like hid his feelings in the bottle and in like kind of like gruff kind of behavior. Um
Well, the other
we
interesting thing is that when you look at what motorcycle culture imitated with the Wild One, you look at
Mhm,
Sonny Barger, who was the face of the Hells Angels in the 1960s. He said, "I love the Wild One. It was really influential to me, but not Brando. Brando's character was just a bully. Lee Marvin was the man. I mean, Lee Marvin rode the Harley.
yeah,
Sonny Barger, they said, bought at auction the jersey that Lee Marvin wore in the Wild One
right.
because Lee Marvin really represented even more than Brando did that motorcycle culture, the hard drinking wild man. I mean, his performance in that was terrific. And if the filmmakers and Brando, who had a hand in the script, if the filmmakers were putting in some sort of gay subtext into the film, Lee Marvin didn't even have to be aware of it. He's just playing his role, and then thanks to the way Brando played his role, that's the way it comes out.
Now,
Well,
do you think it was the filmmakers putting that subtext or text into the movie, or do you think it was Brando? Or because there seems to be like it seems to be like his character, like he definitely brought something to that character. He wanted his character had secrets, whether it's the subtext that you say it is or not. He was there was something we don't learn about him before
right.
the end of that movie.
Well, here's the thing. This film was Brando's fifth film. He played, pretty macho men in his first four films. In The Men, he played the paraplegic war veteran. He played Stanley Kowalski. He redid A Streetcar Named Desire on film. He played the Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata. And then this mumbling actor played Mark Antony in Julius Caesar. He did Shakespeare. He follows that with what we'd call a biker flick, except
Mhm.
there was no such thing as a biker flick back then.
Right.
And there was no such thing as a youth market. This wasn't a movie made for teenagers. That came later. This was a film produced by Stanley Kramer, who was a very liberal, independent maker of message movies, and they thought they were going to address some really serious social problems here. The first are veterans from World War II, came back from Europe, and they saw things they couldn't talk about. This greatest generation, this silent generation, and they couldn't fit back into white picket fence society. They couldn't fit back in a normal society. So what do? They bought Harley Davidsons, which they rode in Europe during the war, which are now being manufactured here in the States, and they took to the road in gangs. At the same time, because of World War II, there was a great uproar over juvenile delinquency. The fathers were at war, the mothers were working in factories, and they said that the kids were growing up and they were forming gangs. And because of the war, they were growing up too soon. Back in the 1950s, before that, psychologists talk about this latency stage of homosexuality kids go through when they're 13 or 14. In this case, they said they were skipping that phase and just going right into it. They were worried about homosexuality within these youth gangs. So, did Brando know about that? Did the producers? Yeah, of course. That was all part of what they were bringing into this. You look at the Wild One, Brando's gang, the Black Rebels Motorcycle Club, they're all kind of fussy. They're wearing their black leather jackets and their jeans are all rolled up. There's no women. Chino's gang comes to town. They got some chicks with them. They got the Beatles. They got women with them. Brando's gang had no women. And you see them at one point when they're marauding in the town at night. All the men are dancing together. One guy puts a mop on his head and pretends he's a woman, and they dance jitterbugs together. And it's all on the screen. You know, you're seeing this homosexuality within the gang. You're seeing not just Brando. So I think yes, it was definitely deliberate, and I think Brando's performance in it took it over the edge. Where here you had Brando at age 28, basically playing a 15-year-old juvenile delinquent who's afraid of girls.
Mhm.
I have
Now,
wait a minute. Burt and I had a conversation about this very subject privately. And if you want to get to the debate now, we certainly can. But I want to add just a few real quick reminders.
okay.
There's a scene in the movie which I love, where some girl who's in the gang tries to remind Brando of the time that they had together that was great.
Right.
And why can't it be like it used to be? And he walks away very nonchalantly, zipping his coat, going, "What do you want me to do? Buy you some flowers?" It's like he's definitely, a ladies' man, and he's not shy around women. He hits on that character Kathy in the cafe, and he succeeds, in hitting on her. So as far as him being gay, that might be, or even bi, that might be a subtext there. But in context within the movie, he's straight. And as far as the dialogue goes, look at, I see Burt smiling. As far as the dialogue goes between Chino and Johhny, Chino's character is, first of all, overly macho. He's dirty, he's bearded, and he's blatantly ugly, I think, the way he plays the character. And when he says, "I love you, Johhny. I miss you. All the Beatles miss you." That's the way he talks. He does that throughout the movie about almost everything. He's extremely sarcastic. He's extremely cynical. He calls, without even knowing him, that guy who almost ran over somebody in their fight scene together, he starts calling him frog face. Nobody knows who this guy is, but it fits. He does have a face like a frog. I'm just saying, this is the way Chino played. I mean, Lee Marvin played Chino. He's very sarcastic. And is being sarcastic. I think he's being more ironic when he says, "I love you, Johhny," because he doesn't love him. He's pissed at him for. In fact, the character Gil, I forgot that guy's name. He's in the gang, and he says to Kathy, he says, Chino's giving your boyfriend the needle, and Johhny don't like it one bit. That's the way he is. He likes to give the needle.
I love you, Johhny. I
Yeah.
missed you, Johhny. It's
Right.
written on the page.
Right.
The way he decided
But that's
to
the way
play
he
it.
talks.
Yeah, that's the
Before
way
we
he
get
talked.
before we get into the debate, I
Oh,
want
I
to
think it's too
say
late.
I want to say, as a 48-year-old who grew up like watching, I grew up more watching the Wild Angels or 80s teenager movies. If this is the subtext or the text of this movie, it influenced so many other movies. I've seen the gangs in other movies do that, like the greaser guys be like, "Hey," to their buddies and do the and like act gay and dance with each other. Like I've seen that done again, and I've seen it in cartoons like Bugs Bunny and stuff. Like so for me, it was like I kind of agree with both of you. I'm kind of in the middle. Like I kind of thought like, well, it kind of felt like Lee Marvin, what was the term they used? Needling, so this movie influenced that kind of ball busting where guys will say things that are like borderline, kind of like, like homosexual to bust each other's balls.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
also he was also busting his balls by bringing him out into the open, their past relationship. I mean, here he's saying, "I love you, Johhny. I missed you. I've been looking all over the world for you." Very much like the homosexual relationship between Robert De Niro and Christopher Walken in The Deer Hunter, where Robert De Niro follows Christopher Walken to Vietnam, where he is caught up as a heroin addict and in a Russian roulette, in Russian and playing Russian roulette, where
Mhm.
where De Niro puts that gun to his head and looks at Christopher Walken's character and says, "I love you." You know,
Right.
like Tom Cruise and Val Kilmer in Top Gun. This is where it all started.
Right.
I mean, first of all, you have him giving Brando's character the needle, bringing out these little hints like, "Hey, I love you. Remember, I've been looking for you," etc. Then they do the ultimate gay thing for straight for men who are trying to hide it. They wrestle and they embrace each other and they roll around in the street. And then when Brando finally punches,
Yeah, but wait a minute. Whoa.
when Brando punches
they weren't
Chino,
wrestling so much as they were fighting. They biffed each other in that scene a lot. And more importantly, to show you how he was giving him the needle, Lee Marvin put the trophy that Brando stole onto his bike, and he went, "Oh, don't take Chino's trophy. Makes Chino feel like a big man." You know,
oh
that's
right,
the way
that big phallic trophy which we
yeah.
put off to the side here. But remember, when Brando punches Chino and Chino goes flying through a plate glass window, it's not just any plate glass window. It's a dress shop, and he falls between two mannequins, a bride and a groom, and he falls through. And when he comes out of the window, the bride is no longer there.
And
so,
that does seem like symbolism.
that was a symbol. And
But
also,
to play devil's advocate, could that just be symbolizing regular life, the regular life that these guys can't go back to?
You bet, and that's why the window was smashed, because that's what they're trying to do.
Well, they kept the groom
all of
there.
them are very
There's no bride anymore. That was the thing. And also, let's say one thing. Brando hit on Kathy, but when push came to shove and he had her in the woods and she's ready to go for it, and she's saying, "Are you ready? Give it to me, Johnny." That's when he puts his hands on his hips and says, "I'm not going to give it to you. You're making fun of me." And she says, "Would you rather hit me? Would you like to hit me?" Definitely a reference to when he hit Chino. And that's why the critics at the time said, this movie was a lot more passionate and a lot better when it was between Lee Marvin and Marlon Brando. Once the girl came in, it got a little boring.
Now, I have two things to say. One, I do lean a little more towards Burt's um, reading of this when they do go out into the woods. And I'll get into that after I say this. You guys will be in person on July 8th on Sunset Boulevard at Book Soup or something like that?
On the Sunset Strip, on the notorious
So if any of our listeners are out that way, they'll be in person debating this. So if they start wrestling in the street, we have our answer. But
yes, we will.
But yes, when I was watching the movie, I was like, I don't know. I think Burt's kind of like maybe it's stretched a little bit. But when they went out into that woods, that's when I was like, oh man, yeah, this is. Well, first of all, it was a very bizarre scene, and it was very like, and she seemed like if she wasn't calling him gay, she was calling him a pussy. You know what I mean? Like that was a pretty brutal scene for 1953.
And then remember, she runs away. He goes out to try to find her. He comes back into the town and he runs into Lee Marvin. And Lee Marvin says, "Johnny, I love you." And they cut to her and she hears Lee Marvin say, "Johnny, I love you." And then she runs away.
Yeah, but that's not really what that scene was supposed to be about. I mean, yeah, he may have, I don't remember him saying it again later on, like you're saying. That scene is all about how they've taken over the town. And it's not a matter of Brando and Marvin. It's a matter of the bikers are running roughshod over this poor little city. And there may be subtext, I'll grant you that. But in the actual context, as I said earlier, this is about, the movie is about, and like you said, it wasn't for the youth market. It was about a social problem, and it was about how these people are affecting small town America. And we haven't mentioned this before, but the film is actually based on a true incident in Hollister, in upstate Northern California. And the character Marvin played, I don't know if there was any Johnny Stablers there, but I do know that there were a lot of Chinos. And so much so that, like Burt said earlier, when the movie came out, when Sonny Barger's comment about Brando and others had said that Marvin was the real deal, okay? Critics at the time said Marvin wasn't very believable in the role because he looked too old for the part. That's because they wanted to believe that, bikers looked like Brando. The truth is, they didn't look like Brando. They looked like Marvin and acted like Marvin. And so much so that Betty Marvin, Lee's first wife, told me that the real bikers were so enamored with Marvin, they followed him home. They camped out on their front lawn. on the Marvin front lawn, and Betty would make him dinner. I mean, that's how much they approved of the way Marvin played the part.
Oh
And
yeah,
Marvin got freaked out by it. He said, "Don't make eye contact with them. Don't talk to them. They're pretty scary."
yeah, I know. I mean, they used real bikers as extras in the picture, and
Yeah.
they all hung. The real bikers hung with Marvin, and they made fun of Brando and the actors as the Rebels Motorcycle Club. They called them, pussies. They were look at these are the pussy motorcyclists, because it was based on an actual incident in Hollister, California, but a writer named Frank Rooney wrote a short story called Cyclist Raid. And
Right.
this was about a group of based on that actual incident. But this was a group of motorcyclists who come into a town and take over the town. But they were very military-like. The character in the short story was an army veteran, and he gestured to his crew with hand signals, and they were very military-like. And I think that's what they were trying to bring out in Brando's gang, which at the time, his gang, if you look at some of the pictures, was very similar to the gay motorcycle gangs that were starting up in the Los Angeles area at the time. There were Mexican motorcycle gangs, and there were gay motorcycle gangs that some writers said Brando hung out with to do his research, but they looked very much more like what Brando's group looked like then, and again, what leather culture looks like today.
Right.
I mean, that's the
Right.
most interesting part, is that you
It
have
never changed that look.
yeah, I mean,
Really.
you have this artist named Tuco Lakanson, otherwise known as Tom of Finland, who
Right.
who
Mhm.
does these, homoerotic, very sexualized portraits of men. He was coming out of Finland when he did it, and the pictures were very beautiful men in suits, etc. That were very homoerotic pictures. When he saw the wild one, everything changed. Everything became black and white, and his subjects were guys in leather jackets with the caps and bulging muscles and tight jeans. Him seeing the wild one changed everything, and also became so popular that it changed the stereotype of the gay male, not only in Hollywood, but in culture, from the effeminate, mincing fairy to the Leatherman. I mean, thanks to the wild one, if it wasn't for the wild one, you wouldn't have the Leatherman and the Village People, because that's where that came from. Let alone loans.
Now, there's a question I want to ask Dwayne, and I wanted to touch on the art of the Tom from Finland, and in the future there, Andy Warhol and the punk scene and all that. But can you play the clip that you did play it earlier? Before we argue this anymore? So if any of the listeners,
Ready?
yeah.
Hi, sweetheart. Hey, what are you doing in this miserable gully, Johnny Malone? I love you, Johnny. I've been looking for you in every ditch from Fresno to here, hoping you was dead.
Chino's giving him the needle, and your boyfriend don't go for that.
You've been having yourself a time, huh, Johnny? You do look pale. You've been taking care of yourself?
I rest my case, Your Honor.
Now I want to ask.
I want to go for the appeal.
I want to ask Dwayne, are you defending this movie, or are you defending Lee Marvin's honor? What's
No,
keeping
I'm
you
not
from
defending-
buying Burt's? And it's not just Burt. Burt, you're not the only person with this theory, right?
Of course, no. And I've heard it
No,
before.
I do my research.
Got it, boy.
Ooh, is that a shot at Dwayne? Are you saying
No,
Dwayne
not
was-
at all. And I got to say, by the way, no, that was not a shot at Dwayne.
I know it wasn't.
His
It was a
book on the
joke.
Dirty Dozen, by the way, is the ultimate behind the
Ultimate.
scenes making of movie, book about a movie. It's tremendous. Let alone, everybody should find Point Blank, the Lee Marvin
Mhm.
biography.
Well,
Tremendous.
you guys both.
Don't cut him off. Let the man talk.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But
But you guys both and this goes for Paul Talbot too, but you guys both I don't think, but I don't think biography is the word. You guys take us there. You put us, yeah, you're like holding time machines in your hand. Dirty Dozen is an exciting movie, one of the most exciting movies, the most exciting ideas ever written. And that book the what went on to put that movie together is 3 times as exciting. And
Thank you.
then Burt, this guy, like I said, like it's not a biography. A biography is like tells you, it's like a school book. Like your book, I've really been reading Tabloid Baby. If anybody really wants to know, like get a sense of who Burt is as a person, like Tabloid Baby is a really cool book to read. But you guys both take us there. You take us to somewhere instead of telling us something that happened. You know what I mean? And I think that's a lot of fun for people who love movies and pop culture, you know?
I want to add one thing. If we're going to have this debate, well, it's not part of the debate. It's just something that hasn't been mentioned. That for some reason, for years, there has been this weird rumor that Lee Marvin and Marlon Brando didn't get along and they didn't like each other. Okay. I found out that's simply not true because I had interviewed Stanley Kramer because he worked with Marvin several times. And I asked him about that. And I just put it to him point blank. I said, pardon the pun. I said, did they get along, Marvin and Brando? And Stanley Kramer made a face and he went, there was a respect, but it was kind of a begrudging respect. And I think that's how rumors like that got started because I talked to Betty Marvin and I talked to Christopher Marvin, Lee Marvin's son, and they both told me they got along great. They hung out together and they would, off camera needle each other a little bit because they are actors and they are rather theatrical. One of the stories was that Marlon Brando walked into a bar on location and Lee Marvin was there. That's when they first met. And I think this shows you their sense of humor. Marvin didn't look at him. He just said, I'm thinking of changing my name to Marlo Brandy. And Brando said, really? I was thinking of changing my name to Lee Moron. So that's how they did that. But the fact of the matter is, they not only hung out together, Marlon Brando babysat for Lee Marvin's kids. I mean, that's not something people who don't like each other do. And Betty Marvin said Marlon Brando taught her how to play the bongos on a set of peanut butter jars. He'd hold them between his lap and he'd show her the tempo. And I mean, really cool stuff. Also, too, Marvin got a big kick out of Brando because he was constantly hitting on any woman he saw. and Marvin said he'd come home from work from shooting the Wild One and go, you won't believe what Bud did. Friends called him Bud because he's Marlon Brando Jr. He said, you won't believe what Bud did today. He hit on the waitress in the diner. And then he goes, and driving home, we're at a red light, and he hits on the girl in the car next to us. He just doesn't stop. Which I think is actually, Marlon Brando.
Now it's funny because this show being This Week in Charles Bronson, we were talking about those rumors of them not getting along and then finding out there's a lot of that we learn on this show. There's a lot of like awful stories about Charles Bronson's behavior and how he treated people. And then we meet people, we talk to people, and they say, no, he was just guarded and quiet, and he just like
people. It also depended on the mood he was in, like anybody else.
And we're like Jan Gann Boyd, who was on here. She thought that the way she described his like kind of being ignorant or it was funny, like it was like a Don Rickles, like it was his way of ball bust. We only had one guy on, Juan Fernandez, who just hated him. But yeah, you learn that like, and that's what I love about researching and studying Hollywood things is you guys see on my Facebook page that I'm against AI I hate it because first of all, we got people like you guys, and then you guys influence someone like me to want to find the truth. But in Hollywood, there really is you're never really going to have the truth. But AI just makes that even more complicated. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I was telling somebody, Dwayne, a younger guy that I know, about that review of your book where they said something about a strong French character, female character. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. What the hell was that all about? Yeah.
My friend said that's a character in Inglourious Bastards. And I said that makes sense because Dirty Dozen influenced Inglourious Bastards.
Right.
So the computer somehow
they screwed it up.
reviewed a movie as part of reviewing your book. It
and
was funny to us. funny to us at the time. I didn't mean to cut you off,
No,
but it's
that's all
not
right.
funny. It's not funny anymore. It's
And
scary.
the worst part about it is it was being used to promote my book. And how are they going to promote something when they get it wrong?
They got
anyway,
your name
but
wrong, didn't they? Didn't they call you
yeah,
like?
yeah. When you were talking a moment ago about Bronson, and I'm glad you were, because I don't know if I had mentioned this to you or not, but I had a contract to do a bio on Bronson, and I did
You
a
did.
lot
You
of
did mention that.
yeah,
Yeah.
I did a lot of initial research and included talking to people who knew him very, very well. One woman named Susie Doughton, who lived with Bronson in Jill, Ireland, in their guest house, because at first he was just somebody they hung out with because they were both, Jill Ireland and her were both into horses, and they rented a stable together. And then she wound up moving in with them. But anyway, she told great stories about Bronson, stories that really are very out of character for the way he's often
Right.
portrayed. And speaking about that kind of thing, just real quick, when they were making The Dirty Dozen, Bronson was not in a good mood almost every day for two reasons. Number one, his mother just died. Okay. Ooh. And he was very close to his mother. He couldn't even go to the funeral because he was on location in London.
Oh,
and
wow.
secondly, he was trying to marry Jill Ireland. He had just gotten divorced from his first wife. Now, the irony is, Jill Ireland, who was British, was in America shooting a TV show called, it was a short-lived version of the movie Shane, but they made a TV show out of it. Bronson was stuck in London making The Dirty Dozen. And one of the stories I got from Ken Hyman, which is, by the way, which is why Marvin was always in such a bad mood, so much so that Marvin called him Charlie Sunshine, because he never smiled. And the very last day of shooting, which Bronson couldn't wait for, Ken Hyman told me the story about how Marvin got drunk. And because he thought his time was done, but he was wrong, and he was completely drunk. And it was a night shoot, the thing with the chateau blowing up and all that. And when Marvin was brought in by Ken Hyman, Bronson looked at him and he said, "I swear to God, Lee, I'm going to beat the shit out of you," because he was pissed.
Yeah.
And Marvin just kind of smiled, and Ken Hyman came between them and said, "Charlie, do whatever you want, but wait till we get the shot. And for God's sakes, don't hit him in the face," because he had close up.
Now, talking about the possibility of Chino and Johnny Stabler being a couple. There's a great interview with Charles Bronson and Lee Marvin in 1983. They're promoting Death
I saw
Hunt.
it.
Yeah,
it's great.
they
It's
look like
the
a
Odd
married couple. Don't they look like a married couple? They're on this lady's couch. It's the weirdest,
Right.
like it almost looks like a, what do they call that? Public access show. And
Yeah, I
they
think it is.
barely fit on the couch together. You know, Lee's tall and he's lurking over. And he's doing the talking and looking back at Brock, like, right, Charlie? Like, oh, and Charlie watches like, yeah. And it was like they were like an old married couple. It was like, dude,
Yeah,
these guys,
I've seen it. It's hysterical.
I love
It's also
that.
weird that they have to sit there while she looks at the camera and does the bumpers for when when she comes back from commercial and all of this. And they must have done it a million times, that kind of thing, because they just look bored.
Yeah.
And it's actually kind of funny.
It was funny.
I agree. I thought they looked terrific together. And obviously they were friends in real life. They didn't hang out a lot, but they made a bunch of movies together and they got along.
How similar were Marlon Brando and Lee Marvin's acting styles, or how different were they? Like,
Personally,
yeah,
I think they were very different.
very
Brando,
different?
yeah, I think it was Burt who wrote that. Brando worked from the inside out. Okay, if that makes sense. Marvin, everything was right out there. Everything. That's what, like he was in the Wild One, but in other films as well. Capaloo, Ship of Fools. And by the way, one thing he doesn't get enough credit for is the variety of the kind of films he made. Everybody thought he was just an action star.
Yeah,
he wasn't.
That's true. Yeah,
he did things like Ship of Fools and Emperor of the North. Well, that was an action film too, but it was a very different kind of action.
I love Emperor of the North.
Me too.
Yeah.
Your ass don't ride this train, kid.
You could have been a good. You could have been a good. You could have been a good bum.
That's right. You can be. You can be a meat eater, kid. And I'm talking people, not their garbage. Just the dialogue and the performances were great.
Yeah.
But Marvin always was. I mean, Burt mentioned a moment ago about the feminine aspect of Brando's performances or personality. People forget Lee Marvin cried in Ship of Fools, but he did it in such a broad, outlandish way. It was comical. When he has a wonderful scene with the actor Michael Dunn, the midget that used to, excuse me, little person, who used to be on the Wild Wild West. And anyway, he has a scene where he confesses about how his baseball career got ruined. And when he tells the story, at the end of the story, he goes like this. He tells it very straightforward, like anybody would tell a story, and then he just goes, and he slams his head down on the table. And it's like that. I don't think I've ever seen anybody cry like that. And then Michael Dunn says, "I think you're too hard on yourself. I think anybody would be able to do what you did," or something like that. And then what I love is Marvin stares at him for a long time and goes, "You know what I think? I think you're a sawed-off intellectual." And then they both break out laughing. But I mean, he was willing to do stuff like that in movies. He cried in Monty Walsh when John Moreau died, but you don't see him cry. He hangs his head down and then he looks up and he wipes his eyes like this. But he'd been crying. Things like that.
It's interesting that Brando and Marvin through the 1960s, even though the 60s were considered to be Brando's lost decade as far as films went, both were very influential, 2 Academy Award winners. Both were 2 different examples of the prototype of the leading man in Hollywood then. I mean, Marlon Brando wasn't like a Gary Cooper and he wasn't like a John Wayne. He was the 60s version of the Macho Man. And imagine if Brando.
And by the way, I've heard people say that about Brando in the 60s. And that's another thing I'd like to say isn't necessarily the case. He made some great films in that period. Wonderful films.
Great stuff. Some of his best work.
Yeah. The Ugly American. The Bedtime Story, which actually people forget was a hit. But that movie was a hit at the box office. Not a big one, but a hit.
Bedtime Story is the one I always talk about. That's the one that surprised me. That's the one in which Brando plays an army recruit in Europe in the 1960s. He's a con man, and he's able to
He's hilarious too.
Able to con women, etc. He meets up with this guy on a train, David Niven, who turns out to be the ultimate con man with women. He masquerades as a fake prince, and he manages to con women out of money and love and jewelry and everything else. Well, these 2 guys team up, and then they become rivals. But Brando's performance is like Jerry Lewis caliber slapstick, and he's hilarious in this film.
The scene where he's supposed to be crippled and he's in a wheelchair, and David Niven wants to prove that he is crippled, and he takes, what is it, like a riding crop or something, and he just keeps slamming it down on Brando's legs. Brando's face is hysterical because we, the audience, know he's not crippled, okay? And then you watch Brando absorbing the pain on his face, but he's not doing anything about it. Very funny, and very controlled.
And here's the secret about this movie that I found, again, because I discovered a lot of this Brando stuff for the first time when I'm watching this film. I see this film, Bedtime Story. It's co-written by Paul Henning, the guy who created Green Acres and the Beverly Hillbillies. So I was like, wow, I can't go wrong here. I look at the reviews. The critics say, Brando surprised us. He's hilarious in this. Well, fast forward 22 years, the movie's forgotten, and there's a new movie comes out. It's called Dirty Scoundrels. Yep. And Steve Martin is in the Brando role. Michael Caine is in the role David Niven had. And I'm going, this is very. I started watching the films back to back, scene to scene. Some of the shots are exactly the same. Steve Martin is playing the Brando role, and it's in the 1980s. So they throw in some Steve Martin shtick, and there's 80s jokes about Danny Terrio from Dance Fever that don't hold up. Brando's film is funnier and more classic. It stands up today, while the Steve Martin film is sort of stuck in the 80s as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and by the way,
I'm gonna have to see that.
He's I don't know if I ever told this to Burt or not. We've spoken a number of times. I am a huge Brando fan. I've gotten about maybe a dozen books on Brando, and I have devoured them. And I've seen almost every film he's ever made. And I'll tell you something, in terms of his physical look, because he could be quite chameleon-like. I can look at a photo, any given photo, and know immediately what movie that's from. because he looked a little different in every film.
Yeah.
But the one I think, and my girlfriend and I have argued about this, but the one I think he looked the best, where he looked like sharp as a razor, was Guys and Dolls. I just think he looked fantastic in that movie. Now that's just, a physical thing about how he looked in the physical sense, but his performance was great. Who knew he could sing? I know how difficult it was for him because I read his autobiography that they strung the notes together so tight in the recording that when he copied it on screen, he said, I almost choked to death. But he is terrific, and I buy everything he did. And I know he and Sinatra didn't get along, or that might be a rumor, but
Well,
that
you know,
aside-
he and Sinatra didn't get along for two major reasons. First of all, Sinatra could sing, and he wanted that lead role as Sky Masterson,
right.
but instead he got Nathan Detroit, and they wrote some extra songs for him. But I don't know if you know this, but in On the Waterfront, the film in which Brando won his first Academy Award as Best Actor,
I know where you're
Love
going.
it. One of my favorite movies.
yeah, Sam Spiegel, the producer, was trying to get Brando. Brando didn't want to be in the film because he found out that Elia Kazan, the director, had named names before the House Un-American Activities Committee, couldn't bring himself to work with the guy again, even though this was the one director that Brando had really respected. So Sam Spiegel, the producer, signed Frank Sinatra to the role, signed a contract. Sinatra was going to play Terry Malloy and On the Waterfront. But then as soon as Brando changed his mind, Sam Spiegel just tore up the contract, said, sorry, Frank. Sinatra wound up suing Sam Spiegel over it and always resented Brando, called him Mumbles, always resented Mumbles after that.
Another reason is I had read that Sinatra agreed to do Guys and Dolls in the role of Nathan Detroit. He did want to do Sky Masterson, but apparently Gene Kelly showed interest in playing Sky Masterson, and Gene Kelly and Sinatra were friends, so he agreed to take this the part of Nathan Detroit. Turns out Gene Kelly couldn't do it because he was on Broadway directing Flower Drum Song. So Brando did it. Brando took it on as he said, kind of as a lark, because he said he was tired of beating people over the head with an alligator in his movies. He wanted to do something light, and consequently, Sinatra got pissed because he purposely didn't get, he purposely took the other role because he wanted to work with Gene Kelly again. He got screwed over by Brando, he thought, on that level.
Now,
Now,
the thing, and Brando always brought something different to the roles. He always approached the role differently. I mean, imagine if Brando played Lee Marvin's part in The Dirty Dozen, how different that role would have been played. I mean,
I think, it would be very different. I think he would have done it more internally. There was a movie he did, which I think would confirm his dual sexuality. It was Reflections in a Golden Eye.
There you go,
yeah, he was blatantly gay in that movie. And his character, it was supposed to be played originally by Montgomery Clift, who, for the most obvious of reasons, turned it down. He didn't want it to be out there. But the way he played that character, aside from the homosexual aspect of it, but the way he played that character in Reflections in a Golden Eye, I could see him playing Major Reisman the same way.
Yeah.
He was tough when he had to be tough, and he was unyielding in the same kind of way, but just less effeminate in.
Oh yeah, I mean, he was praised for just for the bravery of that role. No Hollywood leading man would play a repressed homosexual army major, which he did. It was a pot boiler, a Southern pot boiler, but Brando, Elizabeth Taylor.
Very weird movie too.
Yeah, Elizabeth Taylor played his wife, and it was a very brave role. They said it was the first time that a Hollywood leading actor portrayed a homosexual, not counting the Wild One, of course.
Now, Burt, you sent me.
Rod Steiger made a movie called The Sergeant, where he played a gay character who's in love with one of his men. Anyway.
Now, Burt sent me an interesting question earlier this week. He said, "What if Brando played Paul Kersey in the Death Wish film?"
Oh, I could see that easily.
I could see it too, but my response was there wouldn't be no sequels. Not with Brando in them. He wouldn't have done those sequels.
Right.
And I think he would have clashed with Michael Winner. I think they would have had to go with a different director.
They had worked together in a movie called The Nightcomers that Michael Winner directed. And there was something about a bet they made during the making of that movie that meant, and Michael Winner lost the bet. I forgot what the bet was, but he had to go to a public event, some like a soccer game or something, wearing an albatross around his neck. And because he lost the bet, he did it.
Yeah, that was that
I don't
movie, The
know if-
Nightcomers, what was another one, sort of a forgotten Brando movie he made at the end of the 60s. It
Right.
was a a gothic sexual thriller, very very much more sexual than Last Tango in Paris.
Right, it
This
was.
the film. Brando needed the money. He got about 50 grand to go over to the UK and make this film with Michael Winner, a low budget feature. Brando showed for the one time in his career a lot of skin, and he was buff. He was in great shape. And while he was making that, these guys back at Paramount were getting ready to do The Godfather, and they wanted Marlon Brando to play Don Corleone in The Godfather, but the suits at Paramount didn't. They said Brando's box office poison. We don't want Brando. We want
Right.
Ernest Borgnine or Laurence Olivier.
Olivier,
look,
right?
Brando's over in Europe making a $50,000 picture. We're not gonna use him for this.
How great
That's
was
just-
Brando? How great was Brando though in The Godfather? I watched that movie. It's either right before I read your book or right when I first started reading it, because I'm not a big mafia film guy.
Yeah.
And I was like, you know what? I'm the last man on earth who's never seen The Godfather. I gotta watch it. Even my dad was like, dude, you gotta see that. What, are you kidding me? You never saw that? And so I watched it, and my whole life, for the most part, being a fan of David Letterman and Chris Elliott. I don't know if you remember, but Marlon Brando, through my formative years,
Bananas.
Bananas.
the mid '80s to the mid '90s was like some kind of joke, and then he was in court with his son. So, and then I heard people say, "Oh, all he did was put cotton in his mouth." I watched that movie, and I was like, "Whoa!" Like, first of all, one of the reasons I don't like mafia movies is a guy will be like, hey, boss, can I borrow $20? And he'll be like, yeah, guys, give him the $20. And they kick the guy's head in or whatever. It's like, why did they have to do that? But the Godfather, the character had like a kindness to him almost. And I thought
Right.
it was like, it was almost like kind of like endearing, like that person in the beginning asking him for help.
Yeah.
And he's like, I can't, you never had me over for dinner. Like, what I mean? It's like, and that scene where he dies at the end, we're gonna use that word vulnerable again. He brought a vulnerability to a mafia type character, who obviously was very tough. He could have things done. You know what I mean? But
Yeah, but they never showed him being tough. There was only, I've seen that movie. I don't
only
know how
when he
many times.
flipped out. Only when he flipped out on Fontaine.
Yeah.
You could be a man. That
You
part.
can act like a man.
Yeah.
But
But that
There's
part where he
there's a scene when
dies.
he's in the back seat. Yeah, there's a scene when he's in the back seat of the car with James Caan, and
Mhm.
they're talking about somebody else, and he goes, "He's a pimp." It's like it was a little jarring to hear him say that because he's been so sweet and so mythical
Mhm.
throughout the whole movie. That kind of throws you a little bit. But yeah, and
I couldn't see anyone else in that role. It's
You know,
one of those.
interesting. For the book, I spoke with Gray Fredrickson, who was the producer on The Godfather. He produced Godfather Part 2 and won the Academy Award for that. I was lucky enough. I did one film that I co-wrote and produced with Al Ruddy, who just recently died, the producer of The Godfather. And Gray was the executive producer of the film. So I got to hear a lot of Godfather stories and a lot of Brando stories.
You
when
wrote
I-
a movie, Burt?
I did, yeah. Did
What's
a movie.
it called? Dunstan Checks In? That one with the monkey in the motel?
No. This movie is called Cloud 9.
I'm gonna
And-
check that out. That's really cool.
Cloud 9. It starred Burt Reynolds. It was supposed to be a follow-up on Burt Reynolds' character from The Longest Yard. What happened to him? Burt Reynolds plays a guy who is the coach of an all-stripper beach volleyball team, and Gary Busey is in it.
I've never seen this. This is right up my alley.
It's out there. Came out in 2006. It was very funny. I'd done some work with on television, and we did some projects with Al Ruddy and his partner. The money came from Oklahoma, where Gray had retired, and so we had Gray Fredrickson and Al Ruddy on the set. I co-wrote it and produced it with Al and my production partner at the time, Brett Hudson from the Hudson Brothers from the 70s. Remember the Hudson
Yes,
Brothers?
yes.
yeah,
Brett and I
You told me in the last interview that he knew Charles Bronson, or Bronson was his neighbor.
Bronson
or
was his
something?
neighbor. Yeah, they used to walk their dogs together. Yeah, he knew
Wow.
Bronson. And so
Hey, you
go
know
on.
what I think would make a cute little like one of them little indie movies, you know, one of them little like what do they call them? Yeah, indie movies. I don't
Yeah.
fucking know. Uh that story in Tabloid Baby where you guys are in the town with the biggest ball of twine. I think they can make that in a like a in a like that just that story, like that kind of like a little like you know like four like somewhat Hollywood, New York type dudes in the middle of nowhere covering the world's largest ball of twine.
I tried to write a screenplay about that about 30 years ago.
Did you really?
You mentioned it, yeah, called Ball
Because
of
when
Twine. Yeah.
when I'm reading the book, I said to myself, I said this would be a cute. I hate to use the word cute, sounds but it would be one of them like a little date movie, you know. You take, I could see like one of them like Mark Ruffalo or something playing you
Maybe
or
we'll get back to it
all
because
right,
yeah, maybe we'll get back to it again. We'll see what happens.
yeah, I'll
Yeah.
help you out.
Yeah,
I'll
still.
just have you just throw my name on there, producer.
Oh, by the way, I just want to bring up one thing about the Wild One. One other thing.
Mm-hmm.
Lee Marvin was not the original choice to play Chino in the film. In fact, another actor had been signed at the last minute. He couldn't get out of his studio contract to go over to Columbia to make this.
Can
And
I guess who it was? May I?
well, he's a guy he's a guy with some gay sex scandals in his past as well.
Oh, okay. Then it's not who I thought it was. Go ahead.
Who'd you think it was?
Keenan Wynn.
It was Keenan Wynn, yes.
What do you mean gay sex scandal?
Well, he and Van Johnson had a little triangle going, and
Yeah.
No.
We
No,
talked
no,
about
no,
that.
no,
to
no,
go
no,
marry-
no, no,
marry
no,
the
that's
beard.
not, no. I know both of Keenan Wynn's sons. The story is this. Van Johnson was married to a woman and then was also having an affair with another man. Okay.
Right.
So when she found out, they got divorced. She married Keenan Wynn. Keenan Wynn and Van Johnson weren't having a thing. Van Johnson and somebody else was.
Yeah, but why would Keenan give up his wife so easily?
The way I heard
No,
that
he didn't
story,
he
the
didn't
way
he
I
didn't give
heard,
up his wife. Van Johnson did.
I heard the story I heard, and I forget which way it went. But the guy who lost his wife, it was the studio set that up, like to have her go marry this dude because people
Van
thought.
Johnson.
Yeah, we talked
Right.
about that on the mechanic episode. This is not our first homoerotic episode, believe it or not. See the
Yeah, but I
he
will tell you this: Keenan Wynn was not faithful to his wife. Lee Marvin and Betty Marvin saw Keenan Wynn at the airport with somebody else making out, another woman making out. And
why would you do that at the airport of all places?
Well, I guess they were just coming back from somewhere and they were getting. I don't know, but
Back before cell phones, you could get away with all kinds of stuff. You could
yeah,
actually
and
like we
I'll
fly
tell you
away
something else.
somewhere.
Betty wanted to go talk to Keenan and admonish him and wag her finger at him. And Lee said, "Mind your own business." Everybody does stuff like that. She didn't realize at the time. So was Lee.
Yeah.
But he's not going to tell her.
Well, it's funny, I
Just
talked
mind
about
your own business.
Brett Hudson being my production partner for 10 years. Keenan Wynn was his uncle. And I used to tease Brett about it, and he denied it all the time. But also you have to remember also, Keenan Wynn in the 1960s and Lee Marvin were real life motorcycle riders.
Right.
Yeah.
Back in the
And one
50s
of
when they
and
first
one of the
met.
very first motorcycle flicks in the 60s, it was sort of a semi-documentary done by Titus Moody, the documentarian. Keenan Wynn has a part. He shows up with these motorcycle gangs, riding with them.
Yep.
They were the real
His son told me he used to have this nasty habit where he would be on a motorcycle, okay, and he had a sidecar. He put his son on the sidecar, and then on the freeway at like 60, 70 miles an hour, he'd tip the bike to one side, and so the sidecar would be straight up in the air. And he said, my father would do that, and I never rode on a bike with him again. He was
Wow.
crazy.
Yeah.
Lee and Keenan also used to ride their motorcycles in the showroom of the Beverly Hills BMW dealership, driving people crazy.
Great stuff.
I mean, yeah, they were nuts.
Now, before we get off of the wild one, and I want to talk a little bit about Marlon Brando's causes, and then I got to get out of here. But do you know anything about Laszlo Benedict, Burt? Because 2 years after that film, he made an episode of Cavalcade of America with Charles Bronson
Mhm.
called Chain of Hearts, and I think it's one of the best. It's one of the best half hour or hours of like 50s television I've ever seen. And it is a really good acting job on Bronson's part. I was just wondering, like, was Wild One not a success for him, or was it cool? Was it cool for a director of film to go into television at that time? Like, I'm
Well,
kind of confused as to why he would be doing that.
well, the time he did the Wild One, he was hired by Stanley Kramer because he was a European director and he had a European sensibility.
Mhm.
But he had a real hard time with the Wild One. I think in the final weeks of shooting, they said he would just sit there and cry and weep into his hands. He didn't know what he was doing. He had a hard time with Brando and he had a hard time with the film. So I don't know if he had any sort of, fall or collapse after that. You didn't see a lot of motion picture directors going into television after that. But it's
See,
funny,
but
they said that his
mhm.
main credential, besides being European for doing the Wild One, was that he told Stanley Kramer that he had had a very similar experience. He was in Malibu and his car was surrounded by motorcyclists on the PCH. And for a minute, he
Yeah,
felt
I
he was
remember
very he was
reading that
very
too.
worried that something was going to happen. So they said he's our
Can,
man.
I
In
want to
that
make
epi
one more connection. I want to
Go
make one
ahead.
more connection to the Wild One. I just got into an argument with somebody on Facebook about this because they think they know what they're talking about and they don't. And it was somebody said that Kirk Douglas was offered Cat Ballou but turned it down. And I said, that's not true. He was never offered Cat Ballou. The producer was thinking about him for Cat Ballou, but ultimately went with Lee Marvin. And here's why. And I had said I interviewed the director, Elliot Silverstein, and he told me this. And Kirk Douglas was considered very serious. The two actors were seriously considered for the lead in Cat Ballou. Kirk Douglas and Jose Ferrer. And the reason why Elliot Silverstein was so big on Lee Marvin was the night before he was supposed to go into a production meeting about casting, he had seen The Wild One on TV. And when Brando pushes Marvin off of his motorcycle and he lands flat on his ass, Elliot Silverstein said, that's what I want. That's what I need. I need somebody who can do a pratfall like that and be willing to do it. Because he said Kirk Douglas would be too big of a star to be able to talk into doing something like that. And he said, and Marvin wasn't. I mean, he was a known entity, but he was anything but a big star. So he got cast in Cat Ballou because of The Wild One. Isn't that cool?
Interesting.
That is very cool.
Influential film.
Yep, no doubt.
Now, let's talk about Brando's activism. Like, I always knew about the Little Feather incident since I was a kid. I don't even know why I knew about it. It was before my time, or I was a baby when it happened. But it was something that everybody knew about. But I read in this book, I realized he had been involved in activism way before that and way after. And social change was really important to him. But which I think that influence lives on today in a lot of actors and actresses, but I think they're taken a little more seriously now. But was he taken seriously with his activism, or?
Well, actually, no. I mean, looking back at his career and his life, at one point, I don't think it was in the book, but later I spoke to someone and I described Brando as a rebel in search of a cause from the time he
Mhm.
was a kid. I mean, you look at him in the 1940s. Here he was. He had his first role in Broadway in a play called I Remember Mama. He was on stage for a year and a half with that, and it drove him crazy. He couldn't take it. Didn't just hated having to do the same play over and over again. Had a couple of other roles, and then he was offered a role in a new play by Eugene O'Neill. He read the play, fell asleep reading it, thought it was boring and too wordy. It was The Iceman Cometh, one of the great works of literature. Instead, he takes a role in a propaganda play called A Flag is Born. And this is a play that was produced by a group called the American League for a Free Palestine. And this was a group that was trying to raise money to rent a ship to help get displaced Jews from Europe from World War II over to Palestine, where they were creating this new nation called Israel. Now, part of the money was going to get this ship. Another part of the money was going toward a militant group called the Irgun, which was led by Menachem Begin, who Brando referred to as terrorists. At the time, Britain was administering the Palestinian region, and they were not letting these Jews come through. They were taking the boats and and bringing them to Cyprus and putting the Jews in detention. This is, you're going from the concentration camps to detention centers in Cyprus, and they wanted to get these people, to their homeland. So Brando did that. He worked on that play for just scale. He was the only non-Jew in the play, but the star of the play. And when he was done with that, after he took a couple of minor roles on Broadway just to make some money, he went on the road on behalf of the League for a Free Palestine with another actor and gave lectures at synagogues and church and Jewish groups all around the country. Got on a bus and just drove around the country. And for the first time, he saw segregation firsthand and racism in the South. And he saw, life in America. And that's what mattered so much more to him than acting. Acting came so easy to him. He wanted only to do roles that meant something. So you fast forward into, the late 1950s when he starts his own production company. He wants to make films, but he says he only wants to make films that matter. He wanted to do a film about the caste system in India. One of the first films that his production company did was a film based on the work of the United Nations, technical group that goes into the third world and teaches people how to farm, etc. That later turned into The Ugly American, which he finally did in the 60s. But then again, 1960, he shows up for the first time as an activist at San Quentin. It was the execution day for Carol Chessman. This was the most famous death row inmate in America. He'd had 8 stays of execution. They were hoping for another one. And outside San Quentin, you've got the Quakers, you've got the radicals from Berkeley, you've got the religious people. And in the middle, there's Marlon Brando in his suit, staying outside the prison all night with these people. Well, the gossips and people like that, the right-wing gossip columnists, made fun of him. This guy's a joke. He's only doing this for the publicity, for the money. But no, this was his first cause. Next thing you know, he's marching for civil rights. He's standing behind Martin Luther King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial while he's giving his I Have a Dream speech. He's up in Washington State with Native Americans in a dugout canoe protesting the fact they weren't allowed fishing rights that the treaties had given them. And by the time at the end of the 60s, he's making a film called Burn, in which he plays, set in the 1850s, in which he plays a British agent who is starting a rebellion in the Caribbean so the Brits can take over the sugar trade. He's looking for a way to make that film relevant in the late 1960s at a time when there's riots in the summer and Martin Luther King has been killed, etc. He starts hanging out with the Black Panthers. Brando is just always looking, for a cause. But by the time the Sacheen Littlefeather incident happened, this was Brando's probably most legendary activism role where he wasn't there. He sent this woman up to reject the Oscar because of the way Hollywood treated Native Americans, caused great controversy. But that was the first time somebody used the Academy Award podium and that great worldwide audience it had for political reasons to go out and, which now we say, keep your opinions to yourself. We don't want to hear it. But right after that, you had the producer of Hearts and Minds talking about Vietnam, Vanessa Redgrave talking about the Palestinians, and it became a podium thanks to Marlon Brando. He kind of, made the world safe for that sort of activism.
Well, in fairness, though, George C. Scott had done it 2 years earlier because he said the
but
Academy Award was a meat market.
Right, but he didn't do it for political reasons. He didn't think that actors should be competing against each other.
Yeah, by doing that, he made it political.
Yeah.
Well, the Academy Awards was from what I heard was put together to kind of like boost all the actors and actresses' egos at a time when they were trying to form a union, and the big studios didn't want them doing it. That's something that I heard.
Yeah.
Speaking of left wing and right wing, and right, whichever wing it is that says, "Hey, keep your mouth shut, keep it to yourself." I often hear people talking about late night TV, and one thing I hear them often say is, "Oh, Carson, Johnny Carson, and those guys, they never did politics. They never did this and that." And
that's not true.
Exactly. I listen to Carson every night because on Tubi because I love Carson. I just love him. And there's the chapter in your book where he talks to where he does a very long segment with Marlon Brando about one of his causes, and then he offers money to the cause. And he does a lot of segments like that throughout the 70s, the 80s, early 90s. And a lot of the things that Carson would talk about are things that we're still fighting about today.
Right.
The environment, race, and I just found that interesting. I was so glad to read that in your book about that. What did you
I'd like
what
to
was it
add just
called?
one more
Sure, go
thing.
ahead. Hmm.
One of the last interviews that I know of that Brando gave was on the Larry King show. Well, he did one in the studio and he did one at Brando's house. But and this is why I didn't read the end of your book, because I know at the end of Brando's life, as he got older, it was just so depressing, and all of his social activism, it seems to me, went right out the window. He just didn't give a shit anymore. And he would say as much. He would say that there's still going to be poverty no matter what I do. There's still going to be racism. I can't change that. And I remember him saying that on the Larry King show. And then he went so far as to make some very surprisingly anti-Semitic remarks, talking about how, we'll see all kinds of movies of, the cliche black man, the cliche Asian, but you'll never see the cliche Jewish person. You know why? Because they run the studios. And I thought, seeing that, I was like, what are you out of your mind? Have you ever heard of, the Jewish mother? I mean, come on, there's no more
Yeah,
cliche than that. I know I had one, but
right.
it just towards the end, he just got really overly cynical, and it was sad. And
It's
I,
wild too, because
That
Brando
is
said,
sad.
in his book, his eyes were opened when he first came to New York and for the first time met Jewish people and was really adopted into Stella Adler's
right,
family.
yeah,
And they taught him about activism. They taught him what was going on in the world, what was going on in Europe during World War II. And he never met, intellectuals like that before who cared so much, not just about the arts, but about, the world. And
right,
so by the end of his life, I mean, can you imagine this? Here's Marlon Brando, the screen's greatest actor, spent the last 20 years of his career doing cameos in which he just went as crazy as he could as in costumes. And you look at what he did in The Island of Dr. Moreau, which is
oh,
just totally off the wall. His last role was in a Michael Jackson video. Uh, but at the end, Brando needed money. He needed money to, pay for all of his children and whatever else for his island, etc. And somebody convinced him, you watch QVC, you should sell something on QVC. And here's Marlon Brando about to sell something on QVC. So what can he
oh,
sell? They said you should do an acting course. So
yeah,
he rents a studio in Hollywood, invites a bunch of people, and puts on this 2-week acting symposium called Lying for a Living. And what does he do? They put up a makeshift stage, and you've got people like Sean Penn, uh,
Nick
Edward James
Nolte,
Olmos, Whoopi Goldberg, Robin Williams are there, as well as a menagerie of everything from homeless people to Philippe Petit, who walked the tight wire between the trade centers. This was shortly after 9/11. This happened. Brando comes out on stage dressed as Queen Victoria, sits on a throne, gives a speech to everyone, then turns around and moons the crowd. It was
That
madness. It was
story
crazy.
that story depressed me because it reminded me of what my image of him was for most of my life because
That
of
was it.
Chris Elliott and Letterman, and who
Yeah.
I'm still huge fans of. I mean I didn't even really get it because I was a kid. Was like,
Who is this guy?
I loved humor so much that I thought, well, that must be what the guy's like. You know what I mean? And he must just be this joke. But that's what's great about this show. I mean, and to any of our listeners out there who are like, hey, this has nothing to do with Charles Bronson. Fuck you. This is my podcast. I'll do whatever I want. But no, but I wanted this show to open doors and to be educational and entertaining at the same time. And I found through doing this show and from interviewing you guys and people like Paul Talbot, like I'm more excited about learning about the behind the scenes things and reading about these movies than I really am watching them, you know? So it's like a real big honor for me to have you guys on because I mean, when I get a book and I have to read it for the show, like I love that. I absolutely love that. I have one on the way. I can't say too much about it, but someone uh was in Charles Bronson and Jill's life. That's all I'm going to say. That they wrote a book, and it's some of those stories are in there, and they're going to be on the show. And I love what you guys do. And I know Burt, your next book is Shemp, correct?
Yep.
Shemp Howard.
Shemp Howard.
And Dwayne, what are you working on?
I'm working on a proposal that I'm going to turn into our agent, Lee Sobel, about the 4 specific gangster films of James Cagney.
Oh,
Nice.
I'm a huge fan of Cagney. Always have
me
been.
too. Me
The
too.
story I think I told this to Burt. The story I like to tell people is that when I was a little boy, when I was about 10 years old, I got in trouble doing something, and instead of beating the tar out of me, my mother decided to use a little psychology, and she knew Angels with Dirty Faces was going to be on.
Great
She,
movie.
and she made me watch it, and she wanted me to learn a lesson. And I watched the whole movie, and my back is to her. I'm facing the TV, and she turned off the TV and said, "Did you learn a lesson?" And I looked at my mother and went, "Yeah, I learned that James Cagney is great." I couldn't stop crying. And from that moment on, I was a Cagney fan, and naturally, I still am.
Yeah,
I'm getting a lot of great exclusives.
that's awesome. He's great. And you know, I loved discovering that I enjoyed his musicals too, because I thought when I first discovered Cagney, I was all about the gangster films, and then
Right.
I see the Footlight Parade, and I was like, I love this. I love everything this guy does. It's
Right.
crazy.
Same here. And much like what Burt had said about Brando, in terms of discovering more about him, I was able to get an interview with a gentleman named Robert Creighton, who
Mhm.
is in the process of doing a musical about James Cagney.
Oh wow.
And it's looking very likely that it's coming to Broadway. And as Robert Creighton said to me, with any luck, we'll sell your book in the lobby. And I like that.
There you go. Yeah.
And he told me that he discovered Cagney when an acting teacher told him he reminded him of Cagney. And so he was intrigued. And so he
Mhm.
would go to Blockbuster and rent Cagney movies, and he thought he was incredible. And then he said, and then I started reading about Cagney. And he goes, and then I was amazed to find out what a fascinating man he was. What he was always in real life. He was always looking out for the little guy, looking out for the underdog. He got in trouble for, sending money for the defense of the Scottsboro Boys. I don't know if you know who they were, but also he helped organize the migrant labor union in Northern California. He was a conservationist and an environmentalist and all this really good stuff. And he goes,
Wow.
and Robert Creighton told me, I love finding out that somebody whose work you admire is also a decent person. Because I'm
And that's the
sure,
kind of stuff you want to learn. You want to learn all those things. Like
yeah,
that's why I like you guys, what you guys write,
yeah,
How
it's like
s-
the same thing with Brando.
yeah. How soon what's up how soon is the Shemp thing coming out, Bert? Cause I want to have you guys back on again. I want you guys to argue about something else. We got to
It's
find
funny
another
these days
thing.
we're going back and forth between these two books. Shemp is coming out on October 1st. So
Cool.
publicity is already starting up for that book.
Oh, because I love reading about people that were in vaudeville and stuff like that. And I'm gonna and your book will be the first one like that's not just like textbook. Because when you read about vaudeville days, it's very textbook usually. It's like from 21 to 23. They
Right,
did
right.
so I can't
This
wait to
is a
see your take
surprising
on it.
story about a guy who started out as the star of the act and then went out on his own for
Mhm.
almost 20 years before being called back to the act for his brothers. And where
Yeah.
did it lead
And he
him?
was such a handsome man.
He
Yes.
was very, very handsome, and it led him to an early death. So it's a book that
I
I
was kidding.
think that a lot of the people in the Three Stooges fanboy community might not be too happy about, because it's not a book written by a fanboy. It's written by
Right.
somebody who,
But that's how you know it's going to be good, man. I can't wait for both of those. Um, you guys stay in the, keep me in the loop, and I
Sure.
hope you guys will come back again. And of course, July 8th, you guys will find the battle will continue on whether or
we're
not.
going to do it in person
Yeah,
on the Sunset Strip. And by the way, it's going to be on July 8th, which happened to be the day. It's the Monday after 4th of July weekend. And that was the day we talked about the fact that the Wild One was based on a real life incident in Hollister,
that's
California.
right.
It
That's
was
right.
over, it happened over 4th of July weekend, and on that Monday was the day that all the bikers had to get out of town because they had to go to work that day. They were all weekend warriors.
Right?
Wow. That's amazing. I wish I could be there and wear like a referee outfit or something.
Yeah, well, oh, you know what? You have time.
Yeah, I
Get
know,
in
I
the
know.
car, drive out there.
Look,
There'll be some special guests. We're gonna hopefully get some people there, some
Book a
Hells
flight.
Angels and some other folks to join us.
Oh, that's great.
I mean,
Well,
we'll be
let-
Oh,
making
wait a
some
minute,
more
wait a minute,
appearances
wait.
too.
Whoa, Burt, you didn't tell me there were going to be Hell's Angels there. I'm going to be outnumbered.
Oh, you'll be fine.
No,
You're gonna
no,
have me
they're
for
on Lee
breakfast.
Marvin's side.
Oh, okay.
Your side.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
Yeah,
well, bring
they-
them on. Bring them on.
Yeah, they're going to be fighting for your side, right?
yeah.
But listen, this was a great talk, and I love having both of you on. I'm a big fan of both of you, and this just I love what you guys are doing. Everybody get out there, buy Killing Generals, The Making of the Dirty Dozen. There's great Charles Bronson stories in there. Buy Marlon Brando, buy Point Blank, buy Lawrence Tierney, Real Hollywood Tough Guy. Buy them all. Buy everything these guys write. Fuck AI. We don't like AI.
No, we
And
don't.
I hope to talk to you guys soon.
You
We will.
will. Thanks so
Awesome.
much, Eric.
Thank you
Yes.
guys.
Cool.
Have a
Take
great
care.
night.
Thanks so much.